What is going on with all of this recent Baldur's Gate 3 controversy? Are AAA devs actually scared and panicking over the success of Baldur's Gate 3? Or is this mostly just made up nonsense to drive clicks? The core of this discussion began all the way back in July. Yeah, people have been arguing about this for over a month now for some reason. One game dev made a Twitter thread talking about some raised standards that are being placed on other games due to Baldur's Gate 3 and how good that game was shaping up to be. And the real crux of this post was you can't separate a game from the process used to build it. And in Larian's case with Baldur's Gate 3, they had a nice long dev cycle with tons of devs from all over the world working on the project. These devs are incredibly experienced with this specific genre and even engine, as well as their approach to early access really helped fund this long dev cycle, as well as squash a ton of bugs with direct feedback from players. If you didn't know, most of the first act of Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for about 3 years, giving them a ton of opportunities to not only make some money on that content as they were selling the game, but also just take in mountains of feedback from those who were playing. It seems like this was a huge reason that Baldur's Gate 3 was such a success on launch. And the ultimate takeaway from this Twitter thread was, Larian has a ton going for them with Baldur's Gate 3, and that's an anomaly in gaming. So if you walk away from Baldur's Gate 3 feeling like it really sets a new bar for RPGs, that's kind of misguided, or at least that's what this person claims, because a lot of the other RPGs out there wouldn't have this set of great circumstances behind them, so it would be very difficult to create something on this level again. And they followed up by basically saying that even with a specialized team, time, and money, a game can still suck. Even with good or even near perfect conditions, not all games will be as incredible as Baldur's Gate 3, and when you actually get into a production of this scale, failures can be catastrophic, taking down multiple studios at once just because of how much money has to be invested. I know though, I'm going to be giving my actual thoughts on all of these different takes a bit later in this video. Shout out to this dev because he called it, huh? His actual arguments about setting expectations aside, it seems like this person recognized that Baldur's Gate 3 would end up being massive on both a critical and financial level, nearly a full month before the game actually came out. But in the month since that thread was posted, we've seen a ton of reactions from other devs online, most praising and agreeing with the sentiment, with many devs from other major studios reiterating that using a singular game as a way to elevate expectations is bad. But all of this is pretty old. We're talking about something that happened about a month ago now. Although naturally, this conversation was reignited with the actual release of Baldur's Gate 3 and the mountain of praise it ended up receiving. That all leading up to a video we recently got from IGN responding to this narrative titled Baldur's Gate 3 is causing some developers to panic. And here, IGN basically talks about why was the first response from these devs to pump the brakes on user expectations instead of trying to learn from Baldur's Gate 3, or even just improve how they're working in making video games themselves. The video poses the question, why shouldn't consumers have raised standards after Baldur's Gate 3? And IGN posits that fans are frustrated with large studio greed. Between bad remasters, scummy microtransactions, and just flat out buggy releases, things have gotten very frustrating for consumers over the past couple of years in gaming. And if you haven't seen the IGN video, an important note about this, even though it came from IGN, it really is just kind of talking. They're reading some quotes and one person, Destin from IGN, is just kind of giving their thoughts on what's going on. It's not like they really conducted a bunch of additional interviews or did a bunch of background research for this video. It's very much so a familiar and traditional YouTube video with somebody talking about what they think. And that's how we get to today. This recent IGN video really reignited the discussion and definitely led to some more emotionally charged responses from across the board. Many gamers loved this video. They felt like it perfectly reflected their frustrations, and although there were some others out there who dissented, overall it feels like fans and gamers really felt like they liked the video and they felt like they were spoken for by it. But of course, many developers and industry professionals disagreed here, with many highlighting the panicking developers narrative as toxic and really just unproductive. And one of the most well-articulated responses to this video is in this article. This being an article that several other developers have backed up and even praised. This article describes how the IGN video didn't put in much effort into figuring out why devs struggle with things like buggy releases or some of the other problems it brought up. It just kind of highlights them and points them out as happening, but doesn't get any deeper than that. And it goes on to describe how the video was more directed attacks from an uninformed journalist who was failing as a journalist, describing how yelling isn't journalism. And it goes on to describe how games release broken due to running out of money or shareholders mandating that the game must drop in a specific window, which devs have basically no control over. It touches on how IGN brought up Baldur's Gate 3 early access, but it's ironic to praise Baldur's Gate 3 for releasing it in a polished state compared to other games, when technically speaking, Baldur's Gate 3 was on sale for 3 years for $60 in an incomplete state because, yeah, it was early access. You could just play Act 1. And as such, the entire premise of the IGN video isn't even correct because Baldur's Gate 3 didn't originally release in a polished state. And honestly, slight pushback on this one. I feel like this article was almost missing the point of the video or just arguing something different. The article is claiming that the main point of the IGN video was highlighting AAA games that don't come out polished on day one, while Baldur's Gate 3 did come out polished on day one. I don't know if they watched a different video, but to me, the IGN video was more of a criticism of the developer responses and pushback, and used buggy releases and user frustration with them as an example, but it definitely wasn't the main point of the video, at least not in my opinion. But overall, this article articulates that Baldur's Gate 3 did not drop as a polished $60 release. Early access was a major factor. Other games cannot be held to the same standard as Baldur's Gate 3 because they won't have a revenue-generating early access like Baldur's Gate 3 did. So all of that was a lot, but I think it gives you a pretty good rundown, an idea of some of the different narratives going on and some of the responses behind them. And honestly, I feel like my take on this one is just that everyone here is kind of wrong, but also kind of right. Which, like, yeah, that does sound like a cop-out, but is genuinely how I felt as I was doing the research and making this video. Like, if we look back at that initial tweet chain about Baldur's Gate 3 being used as an example to raise standards, like, yeah, I get the sentiment. Baldur's Gate 3 had an odd development, early access actually being a huge success here. Most other games wouldn't be able to recreate this success, and even if they could, it won't be on this scale. So it's very dangerous for gamers to start expecting all games to release like this. Although I definitely think it's very convenient how this is all framed. Baldur's Gate 3 went into early access with 20 to 30 hours of content playable. They had to make all of that content first, and even going into early access at all is a pretty major decision and a huge risk. Baldur's Gate 3 happened to be an example of early access working, but at the same time it could have backfired and it really killed a lot of the hype for the game. And even beyond that, it's not like Baldur's Gate 3 didn't have other major roadblocks. It was developed during a global pandemic like many other games, as well as one of the studio's offices was based in Ukraine. And you know, a $1 trillion company literally stole their release date. I think it's incredibly disingenuous to paint Baldur's Gate 3 as having this perfect development cycle. They hit major roadblocks, and they made some very risky decisions. Moving the release date relatively close to release, and of course going into early access are two things that paid off in huge ways, but they could have not. I feel like there's some major hindsight bias going on in this discussion. But to me, the strangest part about all of this is the framing. Like at the time, Baldur's Gate 3 was just a promising up-and-coming game, and then to tweet about how it shouldn't impact expectations for other games, and then tweeting all of this before Baldur's Gate 3 even releases? That's just bizarre to me. So on one hand, yeah, most gamers literally know nothing about game development. Like you watching right now, you probably have a variety of completely inaccurate and baseless opinions on how games are made that are nowhere near reality. So yeah, occasionally having your opinions corrected as a fan is not shocking. It's actually probably a good thing and something that should be happening more often. But at the same time, we have been getting a ton of mediocre to bad games lately. Major productions that release full of bugs or tons of microtransactions. So for obvious reasons, gamers feel like they're getting taken advantage of. And I don't think it's an issue for them to be celebrating a studio that isn't taking advantage of them and hoping other studios also take notice of that. But at the same time, I feel like the IGN video was also kind of bizarre, highlighting a month-old narrative and sensationalizing it by saying developers are panicking. I wouldn't characterize any of the tweets I saw, both in the IGN video, but also other tweets I saw while doing the research for this video as panicking. Most of the time, it was just developers trying to keep expectations in check or correcting others. Panicking just feels like a completely inappropriate word to be used here. And similar to what this follow-up article criticized, I think there is a version of this video that is just way better. It actually includes more of the perspective of developers and has a more in-depth conversation about their concerns. If we have this many devs all on the same page, there's probably something there, and I think exploring that along with the consumer perspective would have been a far more helpful video than what we actually got. But at the same time, I think the IGN video did really resonate with the feeling many consumers had, and really a feeling that many consumers continue to have. I think for many, it just made them feel seen or heard because, yeah, people are frustrated. These games have been coming out in really bad states lately, and that's just not acceptable. And even as the video does highlight, not all devs agreed with that original tweet chain. There are a variety of devs out there that are taking what Larian is doing in stride and using it as an inspiration on how to do better. As I mentioned a bit earlier, I think this follow-up article did miss the point of the IGN video somewhat, but I also think it is contributing to the very toxicity it's criticizing. At some points, some of the insults, especially around journalistic integrity, just get a bit personal in my eyes. I don't think that's actually helpful or additive. I think it was just taking shots because it feels good to take shots sometimes. And it makes this entire argument about launch polish, but for some reason fails to mention the lack of launch polish with Baldur's Gate 3. If you're actually playing Baldur's Gate 3 and make it past Act 1, you're going to run into some major bugs. Like, yeah, the game's still great, but it's not exactly a secret that there are a plethora of progress blocking bugs or even entire quest lines being broken. The devs are working on it, and I honestly cut them some slack because they did get the release date stolen, and we've even seen them post a little bit of a roadmap as far as what other updates are coming in the future. But classifying Baldur's Gate 3 as some example as a perfect launch with polish feels entirely inaccurate to me, and I just think it's crazy that none of these individuals have brought that up. And at the same time, I think this article makes some great points on what the IGN video could have done to really move the conversation forward in a meaningful way. I think a lot of what's happening here is people are just getting way too emotionally charged. For a lot of people involved in this discussion, it's something they're very passionate about, or even for some others, this is literally their livelihood. So the discussions are getting personal because it's a genuinely personal issue for many. And in my eyes, I think a big reason for the success of Baldur's Gate 3 is the CEO giving the company the freedom to make games like this and taking massive risks along the way. And the CEO even chimed in on this debate as well in a recent interview they've done with the Friends Per Second podcast on the Skill Up YouTube channel, where they do say, when I started out, Ubisoft launched Assassin's Creed, and everybody was saying everything's going to be like Assassin's Creed. You're all doomed. No one's going to be able to make this game anymore. Here we are, many years later, and plenty of games exist. Assassin's Creed still exists. If you're going to make something exactly like us at Larian, you're going to need a large team, but you don't have to make something exactly like us. There's so much stuff that you can do. When it comes to standards change continuously, so I don't think that is something people should be worried about with Baldur's Gate 3. Games like ours are very specific. It's what we want to make and what we specialize in, so it's logical that we have a certain pedigree in creating it, because we've been building these games for 20 years already. I don't think there's such thing as a game that says, oh, this is the standard and everybody has to hold themselves to it, because tomorrow somebody else will come up with something new and cool. Standards change so rapidly that there are no standards. And honestly, this has been the narrative I resonate with the most. To me, this is the person behind Baldur's Gate 3's success, and the reason it won't be easily replicated is because other studios won't be willing to take some of the same risks or devote the same dev time as Larian under their CEO. And this was self-funded. They used their own money to make this a reality and are now reaping the rewards of that. Which, speaking of rewards, Baldur's Gate 3 just managed to cross an even bigger milestone this past weekend. The game just hit a new all-time high player count on Steam, which honestly is quite monumental. For the vast majority of games out there, their all-time high player count is set during launch weekend. But for Baldur's Gate 3, it's not. It's actually set during the second weekend, which would suggest a ton of positive word of mouth boosting sales even further. There was also a concerted effort by the community to try and get as many people playing this weekend, so that definitely pushed things forward even more. But this is a monumental milestone. It's actually pretty wild for this to have just happened. And to cap it off, Baldur's Gate 3 has gotten even more overwhelmingly positive reviews, as it has now surpassed Disco Elysium as the highest rated PC game on Metacritic ever. Another pretty stunning accomplishment for these devs that were willing to take the risks here. But yeah, that's my take on the Baldur's Gate 3 situation, my thoughts on some of the recent conversations and controversy that's been happening around the game, and thankfully, I'll probably never talk about this stuff again, because next up I'm going to be talking about some mods, which are awesome.